Hello, we'll begin here in Genesis chapter 31, and here Jacob returns to Bethel, and he's going to return to Bethel at this point, and God is going to come and deliver him here. So we begin in Genesis chapter 31. It says in verse 1, it says, "And he heard the words of Laban's son, saying, Jacob had taken away all that was our father's, and of that which was our father's had he gotten all this glory." He said that Jacob took away all things away from their father. These were Laban's sons, and here, man will do you good, but sometimes, in order for man will do you good to get the glory. And these boys were obviously jealous of what Jacob had, and said that everything that he has gotten was because of my father, their father, Laban. And here it says in verse 2, and it says, "And Jacob beheld the countenance of Laban, and behold, it was not toward him as before." Now, the countenance is how a person looks based on how they are feeling on the inside. And here it said that Jacob, he looked at the countenance of Laban, and it was not as it was before. It was not normal. Now this man is now growing a bit evil towards Jacob, and just like Cain, God said to Cain, He said, but unto Cain, He says, and to his offering, he had not respect, and Cain was wroth, and his countenance fell. Again, this is what it means here, that the countenance of a person fails. That means that person is becoming very angry. There's something eating up the person on the inside. And here Laban is becoming a little bit murderous and angry towards Jacob. And it says, verse 3, "And the Lord said unto Jacob, Return unto the land of thy fathers and to thy kindred, and I will be with thee." See, now God intervened here. He says that you should return to your father's house, to your kindred, and I will be with you. This is after 20 years this man has been in outside the land of Canaan, in Pandanaram, and now God comes and calls him out of this place. And he says, "And Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah to the field unto his flock, and said unto them, I see your father's countenance, that is not toward me as before. But the God of my father had been with me, and ye know that with all my power I have served your father." Now Jacob now sends Leah and Rachel to the field. Why? So that no one will hear him. He wanted to speak to them. This was a private meeting, and he said that his uncle Laban's countenance has fallen, and it was not as before. And you know, Laban never liked Jacob, but now it's becoming much dangerous for him to be around, and this man is becoming more like murderous towards his own nephew. And Jacob, he says here, he's gonna or need to get away from this man. He must get away from Laban, because now he's becoming more dangerous. And he says, but God, came to Jacob, and he said that God, first of all, Jacob is becoming more mature to know that God is with him now. In Bethel, he did not know that God was with him, but now he has some awareness that God is with him, because he said, now, but the God of my father had been with me. God is with Jacob, even when he left the country, went out the country. Again, this is God's permissible will. When God has a permissible will and a direct will, this man, Jacob, obviously is not walking in God's direct will, but God is still with him. And this is God's providence, as you can see. God, sometimes when we out of the will of God, direct will of God, the hand of God is with us. And we're going to see that later on in the life of Joseph. Jacob's son. But here, this man has some awareness that God was with him. And then he says, and he said that he has served. He said, you know that I have served with all my power your father. I have served your father with all my power. And in verse 7 he says, and your father had deceived me and changed my wages 10 times, but God suffered him not to hurt me. Now Jacob has two wives here. You have Leah and Rachel, and he's telling them that your father has deceived me and your father has changed my wages 10 times. See, this man was deceiving all throughout the time Jacob was out of the will, out of the direct will of God in Padanaram. This man was deceiving Jacob and changed his wages 10 times. But he says, God suffered him not to hurt me. See, Laban, he didn't like Jacob and he was jealous of him. But he said that God prevented him not to hurt Jacob. God prevented Laban not to hurt Jacob. And now this man is becoming more murderous. He's growing, his countenance is becoming, falling, or, becoming more evil as as Jacob stays there. The envy is now growing. And here it says, Jacob is now telling Leah and Rachel about, the situation between him and his father. And here in verse 8 it says, if he said thus, the speckle shall be thy wages, then all the cattle bear speckled. And if he said thus, the ring streak shall be thy hire, then all the cattle ring streak. And again, ring streak means circular stripes. And he says, in other words, whatever Laban says goes in that house. This man was a dictator, and he was, very cruel. And he was very cruel to Jacob. He made him work almost as a slave. And he says in verse 9, it says, thus God had taken away all the cattle of thy father and given them to me. Jacob says that God has taken away your father's cattle, and he's giving them to me. Again, it's not true, because here in verse 30, Jacob was using his own trickery, trying to gain the upper hand over Laban, you see. But here this man is kind of like, telling them things that are not true, but he's saying that God is in the midst of it. Yes, God was, but again, most of them is not true. Jacob is still working in his own way. And then he says, and it came to pass at the time that the cattle conceived, that I lifted up my eyes and saw in a dream, and behold, the rams which leaped upon the cattle were ring-streaked, speckled, and grease-led. And the angel of the Lord spake unto me in a dream, saying, Jacob. And I said, Here am I. And he said, Lift up thine eyes and see, all the rams which leaped upon the cattle are ring-streaked, speckled, and grease-led. For I have seen all that Laban doeth unto thee. See, here the angel of the Lord is, again, the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament is Christ. It's none other than the Lord Jesus Christ, the manifestation of the Lord Jesus Christ on an angel. And this angel of the Lord made an impression on Jacob. It says, because Jacob always goes back to this throughout his life. And then he said in his later years, he said this in Genesis 48:16. He says, and the angel of the Lord which redeemed me from all evil. Again, he's making reference to the time he was in Padanaram. But this was future when Jacob was talking to his son, Joseph. He says, God redeemed me from all evil. You see, and Jacob later will understand, that God saved him from all evils. In his later years, he's going to, remember that God is the one that saved him from all of these evils that was happening to him. 20 years he'd been in this land. And then in verse 13, it says, I am the God of Bethel. Speaking of what God is speaking to him, you see, because now God comes to him in a dream and says, I am the God of Bethel, where thou anointed the pillar, and where thou vowest a vow unto me. Now arise, get thee out from this land, and return unto the land of thy kindred. Now God comes to him and said that I am the God of Bethel. Now Bethel means the house of God. And he says also identifies himself that where you anointed the pillar, because he anointed the pillar there with oil, and then he vowed a vow. And because God now reaches down to this man in a special way, and God will give us one day a new name. And also, if you read the book of Revelation, if you see the book of Revelation, you know, God has a place that he has a special for all his children, and he has a special name and a special place, you know. But here, this place resonated with Jacob, and God identified with Jacob at this place called Bethel. You know, this is where God identified with him, and God has a special way and a special place he will identify himself with us. You know, if you look back in your years, where is God always identifying himself? Where did he meet you at? So this is where God is trying to, you know, God reaches down and relates to Jacob in a special way that only between him and God, will he know. And there is a special place that God has always reserved for you and I. And Bethel was a special place for Jacob. And although Jacob does not know God intimately, he does not know God intimately like Abraham, you know, the God of Abraham, or he doesn't know the God of Abraham. But here he knows Bethel, and this is a place he met with God. And this was 20 years ago when he was a young man, and he still has not forgotten this place called Bethel. And even though this man was not a saint, you know, unlike Esau, you know, Jacob had a capacity with God. He had a special, you know, place in his heart for God. And Jacob remembered God. You know, again, if you look at Esau started off well, but did not finish well. He started off, he had a birthright, spiritual inheritance, and everything given to him, but he ended up well or wrong. He ended up intermarrying with godless relationship. Also, he left Canaan and moved to Mount Seir. But here, this man's heart is longing towards Canaan. This is where God is, and his heart is towards Bethel. You know, comparatively, you know, Jacob did not start well. But here, this man is going to finish well, and this is where he's going to, Bethel. And this is the place, you know, Jacob had an encounter with God, because he said also in verse, in his later years, he's also recalling that in Genesis 28 verse 18, he says, and Jacob rose up early in the morning and took, well, in his previous years, before he went to Pandanaram, he said that Jacob rose up early in the morning and took the stone that he had put up for his pillows and set it for a pillow and poured oil on top of it, and he called the name of that place Bethel. See, he called that place Bethel, but the name of that city was Lot at first. And Jacob vowed a vow, saying, if God will be with me, speaking to that, if God will be with me when I go to Pandanaram, and will keep me in this way that I go, and give me bread to eat and raiment to put on. See, God uphold his word with Jacob. He uphold his word, and this man knows God, and he comes in encounter with God. Also in Genesis 31 verse 3, it says, God says, return unto the land of your father and your kindred, and I will be with you. See, God is with Jacob. Even when this man was out of the direct will of God, God was still with him. And we're going to see later on in Genesis 32 verse 9, it says, and Jacob said, "Oh, the God of my father Abraham, the God of my father Isaac, the Lord which said unto me, return unto your country and to your kindred, and I will deal well with you." See, God was always with Jacob. See, God never left Jacob, even when he went down to Pandanaram in Syria. You see, God was with them, but Jacob was not in direct will of God. He was not in the direct will of God as Abraham was and Isaac was. But here, this man went out to the far country. And you see, but this man had to learn God's way by experience. You know, people can tell you about God, but you must know God for yourself. You know, God is the God of experiences. Your experiences is what God draws people to God. And, you know, Jacob knew God himself, and not through his father, not through his, grandfather Abraham, but through his experiences. And, but again, he had to leave home to know God. And moving on, it says in verse 14, and Rachel and Leah answered and said unto him, is there any portion or inheritance for us in our father's house? Again, he's speaking about Rachel and Leah. He says, is there a portion or inheritance in our father's house? Is there any portion? And this man Laban was also very covetous. He did not bother to leave his daughter anything. He was very greedy and took everything from them as well. And in verse 15, are we not counted of him strangers? For he has sold us. He has sold us and had quite devoured us. Also our money. You see, he sold his daughters. He was a tradesman. He was a greedy man. He was a very corrupt man. He swindled them out, and also he swindled his sister Rebecca. Remember when Eliezer came and he saw all the gold in the camels, and he was drawn quickly to money, and he sold all his he sold his sister. He said, hey, go with this man. He barely knew this man, Eliezer, but he told him, go ahead, go with them, because he saw money. Again, there are many Christians, you cannot trust with money. That they love money, and they are good old boys and girls, but until money comes, and then you see the other side of them, and greed is a very terrible sin. You see, and in verse 16 it says, for all the riches which God had taken from our father, that is ours and our children's. Now then, whatsoever God has said unto thee, do. See, all the riches that this man has taken, he says, is ours and our children. Now you see, now their eyes are beginning to be open, because now God is revealing and preparing these people to leave this place, and now they're seeing all this evil that has been done to them. So they say, whatever God has said concerning you, Jacob, and go ahead and do. And now, this man he's walking in God's leading right now, and this is God's leading for him now. And then it says, then Jacob rose up, and he set his sons and his wives upon camels, and he carried away all his cattle and all his goods which he had gotten, the cattle of his getting which he had gotten in Pandanaram, for to go to Isaac his father in the land of Canaan. And Jacob prepared himself and his family, and then he set his sons and his wives upon a camel, and Jacob took all the cattle and all the goods to go to his father in the land of Canaan. And then in verse 19 it says, and Laban went to shear his sheep, and Rachel stole the images that were her father's. Again, Laban, he left the house to shear his sheep, and Rachel, his daughter, stole the image. It's an idol, image from his father. And this woman, Rachel, is also an idolater. She took his father's idol. Again, these people were in the house of an idolater, and then this is our idol. So, the difference between these people were they also believed the God of Abraham, but also had other strange gods. You see, this is polytheism. You see, it means that usually comes from the Asian Near Eastern uh, region. In those days, they believe in polytheism, and they believe that God is, but also they look at other gods as well. And you see, Jacob also, when he was going to Bethel, he had to tell his household to cleanse themselves from all kinds of idols, because these people, they brought all kinds of idols, and they were going up to the place where Jacob had a covenant with God. See, if you read in Genesis chapter 35, verse 2, it says, Then Jacob said unto his household, this is where later on in future, he said to his household and all that were with him, when he was heading towards Bethel, he says, And Jacob said unto his household, and all that were with him, put away the strange gods that are among you, and be clean and change your garments. You see, these people came from this idol place, idolatry. And that's what it is in polytheism. And they believe in, mixing God with the true God. See, they have different gods. And here this woman went out, Rachel, and went out and stole his father's gods. And then and Jacob stole away unawares to Laban the Syrian, in that he told him not that he fled. So he fled with all that he had, and he rose up and passed over the river and set his face toward Mount Gilead. Again, Jacob ran away from Laban unaware, and he did not tell him that he was leaving. And then he rose and passed over the river and set his face towards Mount Gilead. You see, and then it says in verse 22, and it was told Laban on the third day that Jacob was fled. You see, they tell on a 3-day journey, Jacob already had a startup of 3-day journey, and now they told Laban that Jacob had fled. And then in verse 23, and he took his brethren with him and pursued after him 7 days' journey. And they overtook him in the Mount Gilead. See, Laban took his brethren and he pursued Jacob and his wives and all the household of Jacob for 7 days' journey. And, Laban also, he knew that Jacob had to do stop and go. And also, after all, he had 2 wives and he had little children with him. And this man probably took on horsebacks, because Jacob had 3 days journey ahead before Laban found out. And this man took a horseback, and also Jacob's family perhaps were with camels. They were traveling with camels, and he overtook them in Mount Gilead. He comes here to Mount Gilead, and here it says in verse 24, and God came to Laban the Syrian in a dream by night, and said unto him, Take heed that thou speak not to Jacob either good or bad. And God came in a dream. This man was sitting in a dream during this journey, and God warned Laban. He said, do not speak to Jacob anything either good or bad, for your own protection. See, God promised Abraham. This is a promise God promised Abraham. He says, I will bless them that bless you, and I'll curse them that curse you. And this man had to be careful not to say anything bad to Jacob, because Jacob is a nation. You see, this is a promise that God has promised to the nation of Israel, that anybody that curses Israel will be cursed. And Jacob is blessed. He's a blessed son. And he had the blessing of Abraham. In other words, God says you better keep your mouth shut about Jacob. Otherwise, something good, something bad will happen to you. And this is a character of God. Sometimes God is a defender of, you say that people have self-interest. God also has self-interest. See, God has self-interest about those he loved. See, and God protects his own. So this man, God is warning this man. He said, stay clear of saying anything bad about, good or bad, about Jacob. And in verse 25, it says, then Laban overtook Jacob. Now, Jacob had pitched his tent in the mount, and Laban with his brethren pitched in the mount of Gilead. Now, Laban overtook Jacob, and then he pitched his tent in Mount Gilead. So did Jacob. This man, Jacob, is now in the hands of his wicked uncle. This man can't just all of a sudden meet, Jacob in Mount Gilead. And it's like a showdown here. And in verse 26, and Laban said to Jacob, what hast thou done, that thou hast stolen away unawares to me, and carried away my daughters as captive, taken with the sword? Now, Laban said to Jacob, he said, what have you done? You have stolen from me. Now he is accusing him, again, unaware. And you carry my daughters as captives with swords. And he's accusing Jacob for stealing and also kidnapping. You see, it says in verse 27, it says, wherefore did thou flee away secretly and steal away from me, and did not tell me, that I might send thee away with myrrh and with songs and with tabret and with harp? You see, he said, why do you flee secretly? And you have stolen things away from me. And now he's being repulsive here. He says, but I might send you away, that I could have sent you away. He says, I might send you away with myrrh and with songs and with tabret and with harps. In other words, I could have thrown you a party. He's seemingly lying. And it says in verse 28, and has not suffered me to kiss my sons and my daughters. Thou hast done foolishly in so doing. You did not let me say goodbye to my grandkids and my daughters. Now he's pretending to be a dutiful custodian. And he says, you have done a foolish thing. He says, and has not suffered me to kiss my sons and my daughters. And he says in verse 29, it is in my power. Now see this man's intent here. He says, it is in my power of my hand to do you hurt. But the God of your father spake unto me yesternight, saying, take thou heed that thou speak not to Jacob either good or bad. You see, look at his intention. He says, it's in my power to do you hurt. But the God of your father prevented me from doing so. Also, keep in mind that Laban had an army with him. He came with an army. So this man could have killed Jacob or hurt him. But here, God prevented him from doing so. Verse, God warned him. 30, it says, and now thou would have needed to be gone, because thou so longest after thy father's house. Yet wherefore hast thou stolen my gods? He says, I know that you need to be gone, because you long after your father's house. And Jacob longed after his father's house. And that's the true mark of a child of God. That you always want to return to your father's house and God's house. And a believer will sometimes stay away from the presence of God, from home, but eventually will long to return to his father's house. And that's what a true mark of God is. And it says Laban says, well, why have you stolen my gods? You see, Laban was an idolater. And this man, obviously Jacob did not know that Rachel, his favorite wife, took these gods with them. And she took it and did not tell Jacob. And Laban said, why must you steal my gods? And one of the reasons why God wanted them to get out of their house and their land is that because the boys were growing up, and God did not want them to look on to idols, and just like their mother Rachel did, and also their father-in-law. See, that God is trying to prevent godly line to not to intermingle with the worldly, and now God is preventing these boys out from this influence of polytheism, you see, and that's what it is in those times, and that's what they're looking on to other gods, and so God is preventing them to, go in that direction. But here in verse 31, it says, "And Jacob answered and said unto Laban, Because I was afraid, for I said, Peradventure thou wouldest take by force thy daughters from me." See, Jacob not answering about the idol, but rather, he thought that Laban will by force take his daughters from him. And Laban was shockingly possessive. And that's the mark of a covetous man, is that this man was greedy, and he wants to swindle Jacob, his daughters, and their sons and daughters. And first of all, this man gave away his sister Rachel. Remember when Eliezer came and wanted to get Rachel, and this man, when he seen all the cattle and all the camels and all the people and all the gold, he was very willing to allow Eliezer to go back with Rachel, Rebecca, and he did not want to question the man. He did not want to do any due diligence. But here is doing the same thing here. This man likes to, he loves money, and he's very greedy. And Jacob said, "I don't think that you are going to give up your daughters easily. So that's why I fled. And so I took them without telling you." And then in verse, here in verse 32, it says, "And with whomever thou find thy gods, let them not live before our brethren. Discern not what is thine with me." You see, he said, "Discern not what is thine with me." And he says, "And take it to thee, for Jacob knew not that Rachel had stolen them." And here he says, "Whoever you find a god," Jacob told Laban, he said, "Whoever you find a gods, let him not live." And did not know that his favorite wife, took him, and he get everything. He said, "Take everything that you think might be yours." And here is in verse 33, "And Laban went into Jacob's tent, and into Leah's tent, and into the two maidens' tents, and he found them not. Then went he out of Leah's tent and entered into Rachel's tent. And Laban's men, they searched all the places, and searched Jacob's tent, Leah's tent, and he did not find them. So they went out also into Rachel's tent." And then he says in verse 34, "Now Rachel had taken the images and put them in the camel's furniture and sat upon them. And Laban searched all the tent, but found them not." You see, Rachel took all the images, and then he put them in underneath the camel's furniture. And then she sat on this image, sat on this idol. And his father was searching all throughout the house, and he couldn't find it. And then it says in verse 35, "And she said to her father, Let it not displease my lord, that I cannot rise up before thee, for the custom of women is upon me." And he searched, but found no images. You see, this is like father and like daughter. And Rachel said that she couldn't get up, obviously lying to his father, said couldn't get up because this is the custom of, this is a woman's custom. He said this is a woman's custom, and his father could not find it. And there was no law then. Again, you see, there is no law then that says that the woman is to honor thy father and thy mother. You see, so that thy days may be long upon the days in thy land, which the Lord giveth thee. See, the Lord giveth thee, speaking about Canaan. And that was in Exodus 20, verses 12. You see, again in Leviticus 19 verses 32, it says, "Thou shalt rise up before the hoary head and honor the face of the old man. Fear thy Lord thy God." See, this thing is also displeasing with God. Although we are to, not always, follow man's law, but there are certain things that we have to honor. And God has that we have to honor our parents, and we have to honor the older generation. And here this woman did not honor his father. And but again, this scripture that I mentioned has to do with the land of Canaan. And these people are going into the land of Canaan. And again, people, you can say whatever, but this woman did not honor, and her life got cut short. Her life was cut short prior to entering the land of Canaan because of these things that she demonstrated. She did not demonstrate proper honor to her father. But here, despite the fact that his father was, idolatry, and despite the same thing that happened with Noah, Noah's sons saw Noah, and that Noah was drunk, and although, despite all that stuff, they did not honor their father, and the curse laid upon the grandson of Noah because of this thing. And the same thing would happen to Rachel. She could have honored her father well, but again, she dishonored her father. And then it says in verse 36, "And Jacob was wroth and chode with Laban. And Jacob answered and said to Laban, What is my trespass? What is my sin that thou hast hotly pursued after me, whereas thou hast searched all my stuff? What hast thou found of all thy household stuff? Set it before thy brethren. Set it before my brethren and thy brethren, that they may judge between us both." Now Jacob is now angry. He says, "What is my trespass? What is my sin that you pursue me? You pursue me and you search everything, but you did not find anything from my household." He says, if you have everything, if you have gotten anything, put it before my brethren and that your brethren. So to judge, again, you hear this man is crying and he's, having a pity party here. And then he says, "These 20 years have I been with thee. Thy ewes and thy she-goats have not cast their young, and the rams of thy flock have I not eaten. That which was torn of beasts I brought not unto thee. I bear the loss of it. Of my hand did thou require it, whether stolen by day or stolen by night. Thus I was in the day of thy drought consumed me, and the frost by night, and my sleep departed from my eyes. Thus have I been 20 years in thy house. I served thee 14 years for thy 2 daughters, and 6 years for thy cattle, and thou hast changed my wages 10 times. You see, it says, "You have changed my wages 10 times when I was in your house. I served 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years for your cattle, and you have changed my wages 10 times. 20 years I served you." And this is the lesson of Jacob here. You see, because this man Jacob was going in his own way. And of course, he was going in his own way. This was not God's direct will of him. And he was going his own way by deception and also fleeing. He fled his brother Esau. And then now this man he has gotten life lessons here. See, this is Jacob's life lesson is shown vividly on this chapter, verses 38 to 41. Of course, God forgive him, and God will forgive you, but doesn't mean that life will. See, this man had to learn life lessons here, and Paul is saying also to the believers. He says, "Do not be deceived; that God is not mocked," as Paul mentioned here. And continue in verse 42. He says, "Accept the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac had been with me. Surely thou hast sent me away now empty. God has seen my affliction and the labor of my hands, and rebuked thee yesternight." Now, here it says God who sees. God is God who sees the affliction. And God here, as I mentioned, in the time of Hagar, God is the God who sees, El Roy. And he says, oh, except God has not seen my affliction, and except God had not been with me, so you would have sent me away empty handed. And which is true, because that's what this man intended to do to Jacob. And the character of God is that God is just. God will not allow Jacob to leave empty handed, and God is just again. And Jacob realizes that God had been with him. And here, continuing in verse 43, it says, And Laban answered and said unto Jacob, These daughters are my daughters, and these children are my children, and these cattle are my cattle, and all that thou seest is mine. And what can I do this day unto these my daughters, and unto their children which they have borne? And this man is possessive, and he says that these are my daughters. And then he claimed them. He says also, he said, these are my children, and these are Jacob's children. Now he claims Jacob's children as well. And he says, all these cattle you have are my cattle, and everything you see is mine. And in other words, he says, all of this that you have, everything that you have is mine. And this man is a wicked taskmaster. He wants to claim everything Jacob had. And then in verse 44 it says, Now therefore come thou, let us make a covenant, I and thou, and let it be for a witness between me and thee. And Jacob took a stone and set it for a pillar. And Jacob said unto his brethren, Gather stones. And they took stones and made an heap, and they did eat there upon the heap. Now Laban now wants to make a covenant with Jacob. And he said that I will make a witness between you and me. And then he took up a stone and set up a pillar in it, and Jacob did the same as well. And here they did a ceremonial meal together. And here, this is on top of this huge heap of stones that they made. And the stone is a monument of testimony in Aramaic. You know, this is what it is. It's a monument of testimony, this heap of witness to hold each other as a truce or a claim on an oath that these men are going to take here. Then in verse 47 it says, And Laban called it Jegasahaduath, but Jacob called it Galeed. See, and Laban, he called this name Jegasahaduath, and this means it's called in the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans call it is a heap of witness. This is a heap of witness between these two men, but Jacob called it Galeed. And in Hebrew also it's called a witness, but it's in Hebrew. Then verse 48 and says, And Laban said, This heap is a witness between me and thee, and this day. Therefore was the name of it called Galeed and Mizpah, for he said, The Lord watch between me and thee when we are absent one from another. Now Laban said, This is a heap of witness, and the Lord is going to watch between me and you when we are absent from each other. You see, he's making a way of a boundary of protection for him and his family. And then in verse 50 he says, If thou shalt afflict my daughters, or if thou shalt take other wives beside my daughters, no man is with us. See, God is witness between me and thee. And it says, And Laban said to Jacob, Behold this heap, and behold this pillar which I have cast between me and thee, this heap of witness, and this pillar shall be witness, that I will not pass over this heap to thee, and that thou shalt not pass over in this pillar unto me for harm. See, this is a heap of protection between them. It's an oath that Jacob will not retaliate. So this man is pretty much a guilty conscience here, and he's feeling uneasy. And he says here, and Laban here, he names his terms in this heap. See, if you take over, if you take another other daughters beside my daughter, or afflict them, and he said, no man is going to be able to witness that, but God is going to do that. See, and Laban is just basically being religious at this point. And Jacob is a man of destiny, and this man is just being fearful. Laban is just being fearful of losing control, and he could have just blessed, Jacob, and he could have just blessed Isaac and sent him on his way. And see, Laban says, "You will not come over to this side of my territory to harm me, and I will not come over to your territory to harm you." See, this man is guilt-ridden. He is guilt-ridden, and he just wants to protect himself. And then he says here in verse 53, he says, "And God of Abraham and God of Nahor and God of their father, judge between us." And Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac. See, he says, God of Abraham, the God of Nahor, the God of their father. See, judge between me. Laban knows God. He knows God, but not intimately. He does not know God intimately. And he knows God as the God of his father Nahor. But this man is also idolatrous. He's an idolatrous man. This is polytheistic people back then, and he knows God, but he served other gods. After all, God spoke to him earlier when he was trying to come and harm Jacob, and he said, "Do not speak to him, either good or bad." So he knows God, but not intimately. And then Jacob here, he swore with his father's name, Isaac. And you see, Isaac is still, Jacob's father is still a very big influence in Jacob's life. You see, and Jacob suffered. He offered sacrifice upon the mount with Laban, and they both ate. And then he says in verse 55, "And early in the morning Laban rose up and kissed his sons and his daughters and blessed them, and Laban departed and returned to his place." See, this man comes here now and he kisses his daughters and grandkids, and you see, God gave him an honorable exit, because this thing could have been worse. And despite Laban's ways, things could have gotten way worse in this confrontation between him and Jacob. But rather, he blessed them and sent them off. And Laban then left, and he's going to go back home. And he returns back to his house. More is that Jacob went in his own way. 20 years, he went out in his own way, and he was out of the direct will of God. And then he went down to Padanaram, and this was his turmoil. As a result, this happened, all this calamity that happened to him, I was as a result of him going out of God's direct way for him. God's direct will. God had to teach this man a lesson of deception. See, and Jacob, like his father Abraham, he returns, and he now heads to Bethel. He returns back from where he veered off. Now he's now going to be heading to Bethel. So the next chapter in Genesis 32, we're going to discuss more about Jacob when he returns to Canaan, and he prepares to meet his brother Esau. And he's going to meet an angel of the Lord here. And this angel of the Lord is a pre-incarnated Christ. So we're going to continue on the next chapter. Until then, precious saints, God bless.